At 5:15 a.m. on Wednesday, the 12th of November, 1980, a Dallas police dispatch operator logged a call from a man reporting to have seen a woman's body. He was calling from a block on Bryant Street in Dallas, Texas. The police arrived to find the body of a woman, naked from the waist down. She was bare underneath an unbuttoned shirt. It's immediately determined a death by strangulation. From the ID found on her body, she's identified as 32-year-old Wanda Faye Roberts. A young blonde-haired, brown-eyed woman walks into Pauline's bar with her male companions. She might have appeared a floozy, looking very suggestive. She's managed to catch the attention of some other bar-goers besides her trio of friends. One of the regulars whose interest she'd piqued was none other than Edward Carroll Cole. Wanda, attracted to this more mature, better-looking older male, ditches her relatively much younger friends for this unknown man. Unbeknownst to her, Wanda inadvertently approaches her own predator, who would eventually take her life that night. Wanda asked Eddie, as he'd introduced himself to her, to help her get rid of her young friends who were now agitated he stole their date. The intoxicated trio approached menacingly towards Carroll, confronting him, and after a short exchange of words, the bartender breaks up the potential brawl. Both parties go their way, leaving Wanda with her new catch for the night. After a brief flirt, they look for somewhere private, where they can consummate the night, or so she thought. Carroll pays his tab, and the two walk out of the bar. Little did she know, it would be the last time anybody would see her alive. They find a car nearby, which doesn't belong to either of them, where they begin to kiss and make out. Slowly, Carroll raises his hands to her throat, and before she could say anything, his fingers tighten their clasp around her throat. She can barely let out a scream. Carroll effortlessly forces Wanda to her knees. Hovering on top of her, he continues to squeeze, and after several minutes, sees she's still gasping for air. So he takes out his belt and uses it to finish the job. Wanda gives her last movements in form of tremors, and finally she's dead. Her swollen tongue protruding from her mouth, he drags the corpse of Wanda Roberts to a driveway. But before he left the scene of his gruesome murder, he removes her jeans and underwear and spread her limp limbs so he could desecrate her corpse. But his victim's bowels had gone during the strangulation, and so Carroll was too disgusted to continue with his necrophilous act. Laverne Cole was born and raised in Fargo, North Dakota. He met and married Vesta Odom and settled in the Iowa city of Sioux as man and wife. In 1933, their first son, Richard Keith Cole, was born to them. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Nancy. Carroll Edward Cole, nicknamed Carroll, was born on the 9th of May, 1938. The following year, they were joined by a sister, Patricia. It was 1939, the era of the Great Depression, and Sioux, Iowa wasn't doing pretty well. There was a lot of migration out of the city. Laverne gathered his family and moved west to California and settled in Richmond. It was also the year Laverne was drafted into the Army to fight in the Second World War. In 1943 or 1944, they were joined by a new arrival, Linda. While his father was away, fighting for his country, his mother was up to no good. She became unfaithful to his father and began seeing other men. She would take her innocent child along on her dates and get drunk. Whilst intoxicated with alcohol, she would engage in sexual activity, not minding young Carroll was within earshot or even watching possibly. At a tender age, he was being exposed to unfamiliar locations, people, and inappropriate behavior. And just to make sure he didn't tell his father, his mother would beat him up and threaten him to keep his mouth shut. It's known in some accounts his mother dressed him in girls' clothes. Being 5 years old, he was too old for the creche, where his younger ones would have gone. But at the same time, being too young for elementary, he was the unlucky one left at home. You could say he was set up from birth. He just happened to be born at a time he'd be at home when things fall apart. He got the brunt of it. His mother was neglectful of him as she went on with her lovers. It was at this time Carroll later says he learned masturbation. He slowly becomes withdrawn. He faced further mockery from his peers and was already developing hatred for women. His favorite hiding place was the crawl space underneath the floorboards. It must have been a very tough childhood for little Carroll, because by the time he was 7 years old, he had killed his first animal. This would be the first step in Carroll's life in the direction of what would come to be defined as the signature telltale signs of a psychotic serial killer. His father came home after 6 long years from the war, and the beatings from his mother ceased. His father wasn't abusive towards him, nor did he abuse drugs or alcohol. At last, Carroll could catch a breath, or spoken too soon, because in 1945, when Carroll was 7, he began first grade. At school, his mates would mock him for having a girl's name. I'm not sure if this constituted bullying, but it's clearly something he never forgot. He must have hated being teased, because it would then be the reason for his first murder. One day, Carroll was at home when his father had begun working in a shipping yard. It was one of those days he'd been on the receiving end of his mother's brutal treatment. He'd gone into his secret hiding place, holding their family's puppy, and suddenly he blacked out. He might have squeezed the puppy so tight, unknowingly, until it died. However, when he came around, he had no memory of what had occurred in the immediate past, but he found the puppy, strangled, dead, right before him. From this moment, Carroll would begin his fantasies of killing females, women who dare cross his path, just like his mother. One of the boys who teased Carroll was a boy named Dwayne. Dwayne may have been the same age as Carroll himself at the time. Carroll hated Dwayne and sought for an opportunity to hurt him because he teased him about his name being a girl's name. The following year, Carroll found his opportunity. One day, Carroll went swimming with some of his peers at the Richmond Yacht Harbor. He kept close watch on Dwayne, and once everyone left the pool area, he went for his target. He callously pinned Dwayne's head down under the water until he died. Surprisingly, Carroll would be assessed as having a high IQ score, which was in stark contrast to his below-average performance. On average, he was a D+ student. This could have indicated he wasn't paying attention in school, and a telltale sign he was probably being neglected at home. So not so surprisingly, at 14, he became an alcoholic like his mom had been. He began stealing liquor to fund his habit, and inevitably, Carroll, a young pubescent teen, would drop out of school. The behavioral blueprint of the psychotic serial killer. Sociopathogenesis, a word that doesn't exist in any dictionary, or should it? In the immediate years after becoming a high school dropout, Carroll wasted away his time doing nothing. At age 18, having no school certificates and no money of his own, he goes to work in a factory, the first stepping stone in the right direction. Shortly, he upgrades to the Navy. However, this stroke of good luck is only short-lived, as he engages in disorderly behavior and does time in the military brig for drinking and theft of military property. Unable to get his act together, he gets kicked out 2 years later following an arrest in San Diego. He's held under suspicion of grand larceny. After this final stunt in the Army, he is discharged dishonorably. With nowhere else to go, a disgraced 20-year-old Carroll returns to his family home in Richmond, back to the hardship and abuse he once left behind, for his mother would resume her abusive treatment of him. Now she would mentally and emotionally abuse him, reminding him always he was a failure. For the next few years, he would move from one odd job to the next. In between odd jobs, he was busy building up his rap sheet. He would get involved in petty crime and antisocial behavior, and faced arrest on many occasions. I have a question for you. What is a person who moves from job to job and in between faces arrest for crime and antisocial behavior? A career criminal. Get that? Huh. Well, enough of the banter. We digress. They say the idle mind is the devil's workshop. With nothing better to do with his life, Carroll slowly but surely migrates to the next phase of his life of becoming a serial killer. Carroll attacks a couple on Lover's Lane, attacking them with a hammer. He's convicted of assault with a deadly weapon and sentenced to 30 days on the county work farm. About 6 months afterwards, probably looking to turn a new leaf, Carroll opens up to a police officer about his sociopathic tendencies towards women. He was candid about the struggle with violent urges to rape and strangle women. The officer advised him to commit himself into a mental institution. Carroll takes the advice and checks himself into Napa State Hospital for 90 days. Carroll would spend 90 days here undergoing evaluation. They would find his abnormalities were beyond their scope and referred him to a more equipped facility to continue to undergo psychiatric treatment. Carroll would further involve himself in crime, and in July of 1961, just 4 months after his discharge from Napa, he's serving 6 months for auto theft. It was during his stay here that he requests psychiatric help. This is granted by the judge, and in October of that same year, he is admitted into the Atascadero State Hospital. Whilst at the Atascadero State Hospital, he was diagnosed as passive dependent with a facade of independence and confusion concerning sexual identification and referred to another state facility. During his evaluations, he was observed as being afraid of the female figure and incapable of an erection, intercourse, or both with the woman. A bit like the case of Richard Speck, however, the difference would be that Speck couldn't be in a committed relationship to have an erection, so he didn't have to kill his victims, except for reasons that he needed to hide the evidence of his crimes. In the case of Carroll Edward Cole, he could only sleep with them if they were dead. He was diagnosed as having a chronic, undifferentiated type of schizophrenia. Despite the macabre revelations of this abnormal personality, he was released indefinitely 6 months later. In May 1963, 25-year-old Carroll went to stay with family brother in Dallas, Texas. He was probably coming to terms with the consequences of his debilitating mental illness. It was a life sentence, and there was no way out. Only 2 months later, he gave in to his diabolical urges. He sought his victim as planned, but when alone with her, he couldn't go through with his intentions. Experiencing a crisis, he got hold of pills and attempted suicide. He was found and taken to a hospital where he was admitted into the psychiatric ward for 4 days. But this didn't stop his ways. He met and married Neville Billy Whitworth, a stripper, just like his mother. She was also an alcoholic, and they both lived in a motel for a few years. Carroll became suspicious and paranoid of Neville, and he suspected her of having affairs with other men at the motel where they were staying. In a rage of paranoia, in August of 1965, Carroll sets the motel where he lived on fire. That same month, he was found guilty of arson and sentenced to 2 years in prison. He spent 1 year and 2 months of his sentence and was released in May the following year. It was at this point Carroll's life as a drifter began. Carroll drifted from one town and city to another, like the world was his playground. Carroll spent the next 5 years entangled in petty crime, including theft, DUI, DWI, pimping. He began growing in confidence, exercising his urges to strangle and rape women. He once broke into the home where an 11-year-old child slept, and he tried to strangle her in her bed. Fortunately for the young girl, he was interrupted and captured by the police. He pled guilty and received a reduced sentence of 5 years. He was paroled 2 years later, and at 31, continued his lifestyle of vagrancy. Carroll continued his attempts to strangle women. Sometimes his victims were fortunate enough to escape. In some cases, they weren't. After opening up to another officer about his urges to strangle and rape women, he was committed once more to a psychiatric facility. He would again go through a series of evaluations, and he was again diagnosed as having abnormal personality. At some point, the doctor alleged he was being manipulative and exploiting the system to his advantage, so he could obtain shelter when he was broke. With this, he was discharged and sent home. I see Carroll as a man who was genuinely very, very sick. I mean, he actually acknowledged he was ill and in dire need of medical attention. He reported his own malicious intentions to the police at least on 2 occasions. This man was crying out for help, and even tried to kill himself, knowing how depraved he was, but all to no avail. The 60s lacked adequate knowledge of personality disorders and associated mental illnesses, or they just simply didn't believe that a behavioral disorder could be classed as a debilitating disease, one that could lead a person to commit such cruel, depraved acts. In Carroll's case, they clearly didn't know what they were dealing with. After slipping through their hands on numerous occasions, Carroll Edward Cole would become one of the worst serial killers of all time. Carroll is believed to have killed as many as 35 women, of which only 13 were officially known. Carroll's monstrous activity was concentrated to the southwest of America, which in the 60s would have been characterized by a large expanse of desert land. Carroll could have met several women on his journeys and buried his victims in these unmarked locations, never to be found again. Of the 13 known victims of Carroll's, only 5 were ever recovered. In May 1971, still in San Diego, Carroll met Essie Buck in the tavern she owned and ran, located on El Cajon Boulevard. The two left the tavern that evening to go to a nearby motel. It's believed Carroll had strangled her before stripping her and leaving her in his trunk overnight, and then disposed of her body 2 days later, on the outskirts of the city in Poway. Carroll claims, however, he awoke the next morning to find her dead, with no memory of the night before, and he disposed of her body in a panic. Carroll does his time and makes the journey in search of Diana, his wife. In the meantime, Carroll had gained employment in a shop that sold appliances. In August of 1979, whilst back with Diana, he met up with a married woman named Bonnie. Bonnie was a prostitute, and they slept together. When they finished, Bonnie was making a call to her husband, and Carroll strangled her to death. When he finished killing her, he removed her clothes and dumped her body. Some sources would say it was a trash dump site. Others have it that she was dumped in an alley behind a former place of work. As if something he'd been dying to do for a long time, just 3 weeks later in September 1979, he strangles Diana, his wife. He wrapped the deceased corpse of his wife, whom he just murdered, in a blanket and stuffed her into a wardrobe for 8 days. Carroll then has a body to get rid of, not something unusual, but wasn't going to be that easy, because this victim was his wife. They lived in a community and had neighbors who knew them both. She wouldn't go unnoticed. He decides to get rid of the body by burying her in the crawl space under his house. So one day, he gets a shovel and begins to dig. However, as expected, this was noticed by his neighbor, who considered this very strange, because she immediately contacted the police. Despite this, when her body was found and examined, her death was ruled alcoholic poisoning. A few weeks later, while working in Las Vegas for a religious charity as a driver, Carroll met Marie Cushman on the 4th of November, 1979. They had been together drinking heavily when suddenly, her husband turned up to confront the two of them. Reports say that Marie, intoxicated, had defiantly refused to go with her husband. She hurled verbal abuse at him and laughed in his face. Her husband, disgraced and embarrassed, walked out of the bar speechless, leaving Marie with the unknown stranger beside her. The two soon retire for the night and go to a nearby hotel, where they book a room to spend the night together. They begin with oral sex in the bathtub and migrate towards the bed where they have sex. When they were finished, Carroll began getting dressed. It seems he didn't want to pass the night at the hotel. Could be he was returning to his room at a halfway house. Marie, however, wanted to keep going, so she would tug at Carroll to try to get him to take his clothes back off. But this must have angered Carroll. Marie didn't know what grace she had, that Carroll was dressing himself up to leave. Carroll's demeanor changes, and he grabs her neck in anger and begins choking her. It's reported he finished the job with a piece of rope he carried with him. This makes it look like he was always going to kill Marie, whatever happened. Her body is found by the room cleaners the following morning. It was the winter season of 1979, Christmas was right around the corner, and Carroll had developed an interest in coworker, Charlotte Cole, and soon marries her. This is the 3rd time he was to marry in his lifetime. As fate would have it, whilst on his honeymoon, he was arrested during a routine stop and search. Carroll failed to provide identification when asked, so the police officer ran his name through their systems, and it came up on several parole violations. He was arrested immediately. Carroll hadn't yet been connected to any murders. However, Charlotte divorced him 14 months later. She was probably very lucky. One Sunday afternoon in November 1980, Carroll was at Charlie's bar in Dallas, where he'd been drinking with 52-year-old Dorothy King. After their night of drinking, they went back to her place. As they sat on the couch, Carroll grabbed his victim violently by the throat, taking her by surprise. With both hands, he squeezed until Dorothy stopped struggling and became limp. Satisfied she was dead, he stripped her of all her clothing and carried her corpse to the bedroom. He placed Dorothy's body on the bed and cleaned her corpse because she'd soiled herself when she'd been strangled. Then, as Carroll narrated, he raped Dorothy's corpse repeatedly throughout the night. The next day he got up, freshened himself, and went out to drink. He returned to Dorothy's house that night. Knowing she lived alone, he exploited this fact because there'd be no one there to witness his act. Carroll raped Dorothy's corpse again and slept on the same bed with a desecrated, lifeless body right next to him. The next morning, he got up and left and never came back. By now, Dorothy's absence from work hadn't gone unnoticed. Her colleagues arranged a welfare check. Upon finding her dead on her bed, she was taken to a hospital where, you guessed right, the medical examiner attributed her death to excessive consumption of alcohol. Detective Robinson had been assigned to the case. He began with asking questions around the neighborhood. He found the last sightings of Dorothy alive had been at Pauline's bar up until about 2 a.m., where she was a regular. She'd left with another of their regulars known as Eddie. He dug further and found Eddie was an ex-convict living in a halfway house for parolees. Halfway houses are part of the institution, catering mainly for ex-convicts, patients from rehab, for example, and they would have nowhere else to go following their release back into society. They served to reintegrate such people back into the society. In the late 20th century, such houses littered the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas. The hard-nosed detective wasn't getting a break just yet. On the 30th, still that same month of November, Carroll met Sally Thompson at Club DeVille. As usual, they introduced themselves and began talking about life's issues over drinks. It's not certain if it was the same night, but they must have thought they had a deep connection, or at least Sally did, because she's asked Carroll to move into her home on Rollins Avenue with her. Once inside her apartment, they lock the living room door. Carroll is overcome by his demons, and in his signature move, he grabs Sally by the neck and chokes her to death. Two young pubescent teens had come home to find their mother in the living room locked from the inside. After several attempts of getting their mother to notice their return, the door opens, and they find a strange man looking down at them. They could tell he'd been drinking. They barged past the drunk man, entering the room to find their 43-year-old mother, half naked on the floor. Afraid, they ran to a neighbor for help, who followed the boys back to their mother's apartment to see what the commotion was about. On seeing Sally dead on the floor, he rang the police and stayed until they arrived. All the while, a half-asleep Carroll remained seated on the couch beside Sally's corpse in a state of confusion. On arriving at the scene, the police arrest Carroll and take him to the station for questioning. He was interrogated on the events on the previous evening. Carroll claimed he'd met Sally at DeVille's nightclub and bar. He said Sally invited him back to her apartment for a night of sex. He claimed she'd just collapsed and become unconscious when he was in the process of undressing her, and that he was trying to resuscitate her when he was disturbed by the rapping at the door. Sally was confirmed dead at the scene, and in the absence of the evidence of violence, they concluded her death was caused by excessive consumption of either drugs or alcohol. At the morgue, the medical examiner was himself unable to determine a cause of death, and concluded her death was linked to the level of alcohol in her blood. And this concluded the case. Carroll was let loose, and he returned to his life. Detective Robinson whilst reviewing his reports of the events that week, stumbled across the story of the 43-year-old legal secretary. The suspect questioned in relation to the case was none other than Eddie. This was close to his case that he'd been working on, involving Wanda Roberts' death. Robinson decided to dig deeper on this fellow. Carroll's life on paper seemed to fit the profile of the monster they were looking for. He has a history of crime, mental illness, especially his own confessions to wanting to rape and strangle women. Robinson sought to subject Carroll to a series of questioning in relation to these recent events and approached him on site of his current employers, where Carroll was hired as a warehouse operative. Again, Carroll was once more taken in for questioning. In the interrogation room, he was read his Miranda rights, which he waived. When questioned in relation to the death of Wanda Roberts, he admitted to knowing her and having met her the night she died. Continuing, he said Wanda had found interest in someone else and left with that person. When asked about Sally Thompson, he recounted the same story. She collapsed while I was undressing her. Satisfied, seemingly, the seasoned detective was about to leave, but Carroll said, "Wait, there's more." Over coffee and cigarettes, Carroll began to spill the beans. He started off by explaining to Robinson how he was overcome by powerful urges, almost supernatural, to kill a woman, like he feels he just has to. He described the incident involving Dorothy King to Robinson, who realized they hadn't connected that specific murder to Wanda and Sally. Robinson was pretty much picking his lower jaw up off the ground at the end of Carroll's confession. A bit perturbed still, he needed to know why it didn't add up that he was the killer in Wanda and Sally's murder. So, he asked one more time, and Carroll sang like a canary. Seems he wanted to get it all off his chest. He wanted out. He narrated again his night with Wanda, but this time admitted to being with her and strangling her to death. He said he was unable to rape her corpse because she defecated on herself, and it repulsed him. He admitted to killing Sally also by strangling her, and also to others he'd committed in the previous decade. He mentioned the names of some of his victims, Essie Buck, Bonnie Sue, and his second wife Diana, in San Diego, Kathleen Blum, Marie Cushman in Las Vegas, and Myrlene Hammer in Wyoming. Following his confession, he was held on charges of first-degree murder. In the following weeks and months that ensued, during further questioning, Carroll said he didn't think there was anything unusual about waking up next to a dead body. He showed no remorse when admitting he slept with some of his victims before and after death. Detectives and attorneys thought Carroll was an insane man. He could likely get away with an insanity defense, but the prosecution wanted him dead and gone forever. They wanted Carroll to be seen as sane and thus responsible for all his crimes. The legal teams reviewed Carroll's psychiatry reports from their respective institutions. Theses reports show Carroll was only diagnosed as having a character disorder, and there was no evidence of psychosis. This implied he wasn't in need of any long-term treatment or hospitalization. Over the next 5 years, Carroll was to undergo extradition on capital murder charges. In April 1981, Carroll's legal representatives began with an insanity defense. However, the prosecution argued he was an antisocial sexual deviant who fully understood his actions. Carroll explained after his unstable upbringing and criminal life, he wanted the death penalty, he wanted to die. He knew he was mentally unwell and so would have to spend the rest of his life in an institution for the mentally criminally insane. He narrated how he'd been abused by his mother, how much he hated her, and the belief he'd been killing his mother over and over again. He also began to provide details of other victims he'd killed that no one knew of. Carroll was sentenced to 3 life sentences to be served concurrently. In August 1984, a now 46-year-old Carroll pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. But earlier that year in January, Carroll received the news of his mother's death. Ironic, the woman who was the very image personified of Carroll's insatiable appetite, his hunger for strangulation, rape and murder, his choice of victims, and the very method by which he carried out his actions, would not only mark his life with her blueprint of destruction beginning, from a very early age in Carroll's life, but would also take him out with her with a bang. Carroll was held at Las Vegas's Nevada State Prison until the 6th of December, 1985, when he was executed by lethal injection. In most of these cases, the cause of death was never determined. Most of his victims were specific to a certain way of life. They were usually heavy alcoholics and sex workers. Coupled with the fact the 70s and 80s didn't have the most advanced forensic technology and knowledge of forensic pathology was limited. Serial killers and what was known about them was still being learned. The term serial killer was only phrased in the 80s. They were usually called mass murderers. Post-mortem examinations usually attributed the deaths of Carroll's victims to alcoholism or alcohol poisoning and acute liver failure. This was due to the presence of cirrhosis, blood alcohol levels at the time of death, and knowledge of their general lifestyle. Today, the signature signs of asphyxiation, death by strangulation, are bruises around the neck post-mortem, a broken or snapped hyoid bone, pedicule hemorrhaging. If this evidence wasn't found or investigated at the time of the examination of the victims' bodies, where this was Carroll's MO, being devoid of any other form of violence, it's likely it could never be known the actual cause of their death, besides attributing it to their own habits. It might be that much force wasn't required to restrain his victims, seeing as they too intoxicated to fight back.